Okay, in the second video on pollinators, we're going to talk a little bit about the strategies that you can use to attract native pollinators to either your garden space that you currently have or hopefully a new space that you are going to actively be landscaping and thinking about. So some considerations. One of the first things that we have to think about here is that you need to have a pesticide, herbicide free landscape. These pollinators are very, very sensitive to pesticides and herbicides. That's just the first thing you have to think about. If you've got a bunch of weeds, well, then you pull them or you put a piece of dark plastic over them or whatever. But broad application of pesticides and herbicides is not what we are about, because we're defeating the purpose. If we're trying to attract pollinators and we are causing them ill effects due to that, it just doesn't make sense. Obviously, we have to have sites that are attractive to these pollinators. So in that last program, we looked at some of the specific areas where these different pollinators are laying eggs. So we need to provide that for them. A sterile environment is not very attractive to most of these pollinators. So we're going to get to some of these specific examples. And then places for hibernating and overwintering are critical for these insect pollinators. Let's take a look. So we were out at Betsy Kaido's place, and if you look at both of these photographs, you see a great diversity in the left one. Well, we've got some juniper up here. Well, that is some great habitat. That is some great egg-laying area. It looks like there's some, a yucca here. I know for a fact that there's agave and other plants that you can't see in this photograph. You can see lots of grasses, lots of native grasses, and several different species of flowers, some in flower and some not. But that's good, because when the initial group of flowers in the spring stops flowering, hopefully there'll be another group. Over here on the right, once again, another really diverse area. Here's some in the bottom left, some shrub-like, but at least different kind of vegetation that can be attractive to different pollinators. You can see several species of plants in bloom, and yet you can see other species that are not yet in bloom, or maybe you have already bloomed. In the background there are some larger shrubs or small trees and some more junipers. So there's a really good diversity of habitat right here. We're looking at flowers coming into bloom from spring all the way into fall. So there's always something for those nectar feeders and pollen gatherers to work with. So this is at our house. Those of you that have been here, great work in progress. But this area in the foreground is just bare soil. Well, remember 4,000 species of bees, and 90% of them are solitary bees, and 70% of those solitary bees use bare ground. They're not going through mulch, they're not going through through bedrock. They need some ground. If it's sandy and easy to tunnel through, that's ideal. So can you incorporate, or do you have some of that, or can you make and transition a little area to to bare soil. If you look around, you'll probably find some. You just don't want to mulch it. So this is a photograph of our Sambucus neomexicana. This is the new Mexican elder. This is one of our pride and joys at our place. Native elder, some call it elderberry, has these white umbels which will become purple fruits. The phainopeplas and other birds just simply love them. But here I've taken a stem on the long picture on the right, and I've cut it open, just right down the middle with my pocket knife, and you can see it's very fleshy, and it's that central area is known as the pith. And so here on the left, that small inset is simply the stem cut in cross section, opened up longitudinally, so you can see, well, solitary bees can use this fleshy pith and dig down in and excavate and lay eggs. So you might think about providing some cut off stems. Raspberries work well as nesting areas. Up in Minnesota at our farm, we had nesting, the small carpenter bees were nesting in cut off raspberry stems. Here's some bamboo that I found. Of course, it comes in different diameters. Some bees are smaller, some bees are larger, obviously. And you can use these as tubes. These wouldn't be for ground nesting bees, but for stem nesting bees, or tube nesting bees, not nesting, I should say, egg laying, for these brood chambers. When you use tubes like this, it could be soda straws, it could be glass straws, it could be any kind of tubular, could be pipe, etc. You're going to have to disinfect, and that's important, because once the bees start nesting in there, they might do that for a year or two, then mites come into the picture, and various types of fungal spores come into the picture. And so in some cases, just sort of reaming out those tubes, putting them in some bleach solution and letting them dry and getting them back into use. But it is a bit of a chore, so you have to think about that. Over on the right are some old bricks. They were used in a water treatment facility, and you can see that I've taken up towards the top third, I've taken that thin bamboo stem and then the little bit bigger diameter, and I've stuck it in there, and thinking, well, maybe I could stuff 3 or 4 of those smaller tubes in there and provide 5 little nesting chambers for solitary bees, and just something I can get creative with. The solitary female, you've seen her before, from Elroy Limmer. So one of the things that I mention here is that this value of architectural elements, gates, doors, old buildings, they have cracks and they have crevices and they have holes. And that can all be valuable nesting. We're all different in the way we landscape. In some it's very prim and proper. In some cases it's very, very wild. So you just have to, whatever your strategy and your style is, you just have to figure out creative ways that work for the pollinators and for you. If you don't like the looks of it, if you hate the looks of it, well, then you might consider putting that element somewhere where you don't see it all the time, or maybe your guests don't see it, but still you can incorporate these strategies no matter what your style. We're back at the Graves Manor. This is our our new casita. So we had a lot of fill brought in. Well, not really fill brought in. It was part of the disintegrating bedrock that we have right there. Very little fill was brought in, but we needed um, to stack rocks and put up in some gabions to hold that fill in place. But these cracks and these crevices, once again, offer nesting areas, maybe even for bumblebees. Of course, a whole variety, a host of lizards loves to make their way through here. So you attract various types of other insects. You're going to attract other animals that we find very, very pleasing and exciting to watch and to enjoy. The yucca elata in the background, which I believe the yucca elata is the state flower of New Mexico, if I'm not mistaken. But all these flowers up here, that whole big stalk comes up in one season. That's known as the inflorescence. And so numerous flowers are coming off and part of this inflorescence. And this yucca elata is a pollinator magnet. There are ants and bees and wasps and beetles and spiders and all kinds of things making their making a living off this yucca. Of course, one of the major pollinators is a very specialized yucca moth that has a very, very close association with yucca. Pretty cool. So here are 3 photos from our yard. This is on the left an old Siberian elm, and many of you probably think, oh my God, cut it down. And but there's peeling bark up at the top. There are insects and beetles working and living and making a living in this old stump. Of course, it's a great place for us to hang our bird feeders. The inset in the middle, I took my drill and I drilled in, let's see, a 1/4 inch is the diameter, and I went into about 5 inches deep. And that could be a solitary nesting chamber. Those could be nesting chambers. Well, the question is, does the diameter of the hole and the depth of the hole matter? Yes, absolutely. There are smaller bees solitary and there are larger solitary bees. So you need to have a hole that fits their needs. So a variety of holes is important. And the depth of the chamber is important. This is really funny. Not funny, but it's just really interesting, is that the female bee, remember solitary bees, are going to go all the way to the end of that hole, that nesting chamber, and she's going to begin to lay eggs. She can decide if the egg is going to be a female. She can decide if the egg is going to be a male. She puts the females in the back of the chamber, puts a little wall, lays another female egg, puts a little wall. So depending on the length will determine how many females she'll lay. And then when she's laid 2 or 3 or whatever females, she'll lay male eggs. Well, the female takes longer to develop. The female egg will take longer to go from egg to larva to pupa to adult. The males are quick, they develop more quickly. So you can imagine if it was the other way around, the males develop quickly, they're just going to eat their way through the females and get out, typical male stuff. But by having this difference in the sex of the bee and the time it takes that bee to mature, it just makes sense. So if the chamber is not long enough, this is a long story, if the chamber isn't deep enough, well, she'll lay fewer female eggs. And what she'll do is lay more male eggs. It's nice to have a good balance of female and male eggs, obviously. Leave the leaves. These leaves provide good overwintering and hibernation sites for beetles and other pollinators. So, is there an area that you don't have to rake, that you can leave and let it rain and let it sleet and let it snow, and all the time there are going to be hibernating insects, pollinators underneath those leaves? If it's all bare grass or mulch, that's not as important as for many species as just leaves. So as much as possible, leave the leaves. You can clean them up a bit in the spring, or simply leave them and let them decay. What about adding some elements like a rotting log? You see it every day when you're hiking. Well, these are great places for beetles to work their way through. These are great places for flies to lay eggs in. There are predators of these different insects laying in wait, and so it's just a whole little ecosystem all of its own. So is there a place that you can tuck a rotting log into? Something to think about. So hopefully these two videos have given you some ideas, given you some examples. So there are a few things to think about here. So most likely some of the strategies we've talked about you already have in your garden. You've got a diversity of wildflowers, and they bloom over a long time period. That's great. Keep that. Enhance that. Some of the strategies might be new to you. Might you consider adding some of these other elements and strategies to help pollinators? So think about how you might incorporate some of these strategies, things that you don't already have incorporated into your garden or your landscaping space. And then I taught for over 30 years, and I know you are creative people. What ideas and strategies have you come up with that we didn't talk about, or there's maybe some extra added element that would enhance? Maybe it'll just be great for pollinators and give you pleasure. So there's a twofer right there. So think about that, and then don't be afraid to get on the discussion area and talk about that. Share your thoughts. Provide some photographs. Let's talk about this stuff. Get a little discussion going. Okay. One of the things that I should mention, that in addition to these two videos on pollinators, insect pollinators, and strategies to attract pollinators, Susan Campbell, one of our GNPS members, has put together some text with some photographs, and she is really zeroing in on the native bees and and strategies to attract them. Some of the stuff that we've already talked about, but you'll find additional information in Susan Campbell's presentation or text. So check that out.